right, Abby, I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. But if you're getting notifications popping up about the waiting room, don't worry about that. I'll make sure people
Okay.
in the waiting room. But
Okay, sounds good.
Share your screen if you have any slides that you want to share.
Yes, I will have some slides. Can you hear me? Is my volume okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, good.
And Rosa, I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share your screen if you have some slides that you want to share.
Great, thank you.
Abby, Rosa, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Holly Riesco. I'm chairing this session, and I was just going to ask, is there anything you need me to do for you?
No, I don't think so. I think I'll be okay. I don't think anything will be so important that I need to be interrupted, but if it is, then feel free to do so.
Okay, well, I just meant like links and things like that.
Oh, no, I got that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think I'm good as well. I'll upload a PDF of my files to the chat.
Okay, great. So when it turns 12:30, I will get started and issue a few reminders to everybody, and then I'll turn it over to Abby. Okay. And in between the sessions, I will then move to introduce Rosa. Okay. I forgot one thing. Would you like me to remind you, send a little chat about when your time is up? The last one I chaired, I did a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning.
That might be helpful. I'm gonna try and self-monitor, but just in case, yeah, that might be helpful.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.
We have Holly and we have Abby and we have Rose are all here, right? Okay, good. I see you all at the top of my screen there. Holly, if you or Amy, if you're hosting this, I think you can pin Rose and Abby when they're presenting and then unpin them when they're not. And then they stay at the top or stay in people's speaker fields a little easier. See the things we learn over time. So.
Yep. Also for all of our participants here today, if you go to instead of the gallery view, if you go to side by side speaker, that'll highlight the person talking. But yeah, I can also pin them. It's good to see, as a former Houstonian, it's good to see Houston represented here.
Hot Houston right now, or like all the time, but yeah.
Yeah, of course, this time of year.
Yeah.
I have a sister who still lives in the Houston area. Going to visit her in a few weeks. I'm sure I'm going to melt. Although it's really hot here too. So
Yeah. It's like 80% humidity or something, so.
Okay, it's 12:31 now, but I will go ahead and start this session. Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Riesco, and I'm the chair for this session. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here for this young adult literature session. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear about these young adult literature related topics. Just a reminder of a few things before we move to the presenters. This session is being recorded, and each presentation will be about 20 minutes long, and that should leave us with 10 minutes at the end for questions for the speakers. During the presentations, please remain muted and put any questions you have throughout the presentations in the chat so that the speakers can address the questions during the 10-minute Q&A session. I can ask those, or you can unmute yourself during that 10 minutes and ask the questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our first set of speakers so that they can introduce herself, so she can introduce herself, sorry. Abbey?
Thank you, Holly. I am going to go ahead and put my slides in the chat. I know that some people are probably still trickling in, but they'll be there, and then Holly can repost them later if anybody didn't get them. So my name is Abbey Bachmann. I am a recent graduate of the doctoral program at the University of Houston in curriculum and instruction. And I am also a full-time English 1 teacher in Cypress Fairbanks, which is in the suburban northwest area of Houston. And so what I'm going to talk about today is using YA text to build students' sociopolitical consciousness. This is something that I've actually incorporated in my classroom as a teacher. It stemmed from a lot of things that I learned as a doctoral student, but everything that I'm going to talk about is something that I actually used in my classroom in the past school year. So to give you a little bit of a background about my school district and my school itself, just so you can kind of understand the environment in which I'm working. The district that I teach in has over 115,000 students. I believe it's the 3rd largest in the state of Texas. The school itself that I work at is a suburban high school with about 3,200 students. And my population of students that I work with are the 9th grade students in English 1. There's about 750 9th grade students. And in my classes, I have about 125 students. So just kind of to let you kind of know the mindset that I was in, the environment in which I was in. I also planned this whole unit, this whole activity with 8 other English 1 teachers. So it was a collaborative effort to teach all 750 of these 9th grade students. And then you can see the demographics of my school. I believe these are from a year ago. So these might be a little outdated, but pretty accurate to the demographics of the school in which I work for now. So on the job market, but to use that PhD. So to give you a little bit of understanding as to why I kind of decided to, in collaboration with my team, undertake a project and a unit that focuses on building students' sociopolitical consciousness is I feel like this year, especially teaching during a global pandemic, there was a lack of student engagement that I had seen in the past, a lack of student ownership on their own learning, student voices were lacking. And I feel like I wanted students to, I've never been the type of teacher to be the sage on the stage, so to speak. And so it was really difficult this year to pull students from the shell that kind of had been created from, dust shields and face masks and all of this into sharing their voices. A large part of what I do in the classroom is relationship building so that students are comfortable to share their voices and be engaged and invest themselves in the learning. And so it took a lot of pre-planning and front loading to be able to do that, to get students to the end point of the whole project that I'm going to be talking about. So, and I also fully believe in students being advocates for topics and conversations and issues and ideas that they are passionate about, and teaching them that their voice matters. I also am a strong proponent of student choice in the classroom, and I know that that's been kind of a recurring theme in a lot of presentations, not just today, but in the previous days of the summit. And so my dissertation was actually over student choice and the effect that student choice has on students' reading motivation. So this incorporates choice as well, but also helping students build a connection between what they read and writing. So like a reading writing workshop approach to teaching English is kind of how I run my classroom as well. And along with that was looking at exposing students to research, because a lot of students come to us as 9th graders without a whole lot of background information on what research is, what it should look like, what it entails. So that's going to be a little bit of what I talk about as well. And also the extremely important task of helping students understand the reliability of sources and bias within these sources. So I will say that this was kind of the first year. I've done bits and pieces of this project throughout my 11 years in secondary education, but this was the first year that we kind of put it all together as a whole. So I will say it's not perfect. There's bits and pieces that we want to change, rework, move the order of, go into more depth with, things like that. And so if y'all have any suggestions, if there's anybody at any point that's like, oh, I've done something like this and this worked really great, or this text works really great, then y'all feel free to drop those in the chat as we go too. So when I talk about building students' sociopolitical consciousness, I just want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. I know there's people in here who are classroom educators, people who are teacher educators. So I'm talking about allowing students to, and this is a definition according to Gloria Ladson Billings, critique cultural norms and values that produce and maintain social inequities. And so ultimately asking students to analyze the society in which they live in order to prepare them for active citizenship, to get them to advocate and make change in the society in which they live. And often students don't feel, and I kind of touched on this earlier, they don't feel like they have a voice, or their voice doesn't really matter so much. And a lot of them haven't had an opportunity prior to coming to, my class or to 9th grade, being able to do a project like this where they're told your voice matters. What is it that you find important? And talk to me about that and do research on that and advocate for that. And so I think that this is something that obviously could be built upon as students get older, sophomore, junior, senior year, but also starting earlier. So if any of y'all are middle grade teachers, I used to teach 6th and 7th grade, and I wish, that I had done more activities kind of touching on these things when students are in 6th and 7th grade before they get to high school. So I'm going to kind of go over an overview of what I originally had said. This is what the unit looks like. And then I was looking at everything I had down and I was like, well, this is really actually the entire school year. So the foundation for everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of research and in terms of the culminating activity it was all built upon the text that students read throughout the year. So we started the school year with students reading in literature circles. There were built-in novel units throughout the course of the school year as well. And then different model and mentor texts, whether that be poetry, short stories, things like that. And then we had a large chunk of the school year where it was students pulled from self-selected novels. So they were able to choose whatever they wanted to read for basically the second half of the school year, almost the second half. So all of these different things. And I will say that some of these texts are not YA text. A large chunk of them are. The literature circles are YA text. The self-selected novels, most students chose YA text. Some of the novel units and some of the model or mentor text weren't YA text, but they still served the purpose of what we wanted students to pull from a text. So I will be mentioning a few things that aren't necessarily considered YA, but the bulk of what we talked about is centered and grounded in YA text. So that was kind of the foundation. We asked students to read, for students to be comfortable with a variety of texts throughout the year. And then 3/4 of the way through the entire school year, we started talking about research. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in a minute about what that research looked like. But it was very much a foundational experience for students in terms of research. A lot of students had very little experience with research in general. When I said research, they're like, cool, Google searching. And I'm like, right? So, but we had to have that conversation. Like, they had no idea what we mean when we say research, right? And I knew that they would be getting to that junior, senior year in more depth, but and part of this is we have to think about, the effect that the pandemic had on them in their last year. I mean, teaching 9th grade, and my kids came from middle school, right? And what gaps were already in their curriculum from that. I know when I taught middle school, we often saved research for the end. And so it may have been something that wasn't really touched on last school year, and students were at a complete starting point with research. So we did teach them to use Gale databases. We talked about the reliability of sources. We talked about how to actually use those Gale databases, and then identifying bias and opinion pieces in your research. So we talked a lot about that. And then the culminating project was what I'm calling it now a letter of concern. I think at the time I called it an argumentative letter, but the culminating activity was this letter that I asked students to write where they pulled from what they had read and what they had researched. And I'll talk about how we put all that together in just a little bit. But the letter of concern started with a graphic organizer and then a draft of a letter. And it was the first time students were really focused on extensive writing that wasn't an expository essay, because we also have to consider the fact that there's standardized testing that my grade level is responsible for. And so it was lots of things to tweak for the future, but I really did enjoy the structure of the whole school year. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the text that we used, and I'm not going to, I wish I had, unlimited time to be able to just talk about what all these books are about for those of you that may not be familiar with some of them, but I think a lot of these books are going to be books that a lot of you have probably heard. Hopefully they're books that a lot of you have enjoyed. I know there's another session, I think it's later, about using Scythe specifically. So I'm actually excited to go to that session. But so the first set of books, the actual book jackets that you see that I put on here, are the literature circle books that students had to choose from. So I teach 2 different levels of students, and based on the level of students, we did different literature circle books. And I will, full disclosure, that I really wanted to switch up some of the literature circle books this year, but due to the pandemic and the fact that our classroom libraries that were ordered for us from our district not being delivered on time, these were the books that we had used in years past. And so I plan on each year that I do this incorporating new contemporary YA books. So the first set of books, we have Scythe by Neil Shusterman, Children of Blood and Bone. I know it's been talked about in the summit. Flawed, and then you can see the list of the 4 bullet point books on the right. Those are the books that one level of students had to choose from. And all of these books were chosen because of their dystopian nature, some more so than others, right? But they all, and this was a big hitting point for a lot of what we talked about in class during this unit, was what is dystopian literature, right? And a lot of us probably know that dystopian literature is something that hooks student interest pretty easily. And so I think that we had their attention from the beginning with a lot of these dystopian books, right? And we talked about how when authors choose to write a dystopian book, oftentimes they're responding to some element of society that is problematic or troublesome that they kind of blow up, right? So they magnify a particular issue that maybe exists in society and say, okay, well, what if this particular issue were magnified to this extent? What might society look like, right? What might be the consequences? And so when students read these books, I asked them to look for those things. Like, what do you think the author is responding to in your particular book that could be an issue, right? Or that you might see as being mirrored in our society even. And so Scythe, for example, deals with, it takes place in a society where death has been conquered, like people don't die of natural causes, and therefore overpopulation occurs. And so Scythes are characters who are charged with, and it seems like almost arbitrary selection of people who are Scythes, but they get to choose who lives and who dies in order to control the population. And so there's a lot of issues in addition to the idea of overpopulation and things like that, but also empathy, right? And who is in a position of privilege and power to be able to say who gets to live and who gets to die, right? And there's so many other problematic issues that stem from that topic throughout the book. And Scythe is the first in a trilogy too. So most of my students that chose to read Scythe read the next 2 books in the series as well. So it's a really, really great YA book if no one's read it. But and then the second row of books are the literature circle books that the other level of students that I taught had to choose from. So Legend was a really popular one with my students. Marie Lou's Legend. Monster was really popular. Carrie Ann Holt's House Arrest was one of our choices for students as well. And so these were the second set of books that students had to choose from. Our novel units, we did Ghost by Jason Reynolds, but also To Kill a Mockingbird. And then you can see the different mentor and model text that we used. Self-selected novels and literature circles were the most popular books that students pulled from for this culminating project that I'm going to talk about. So these were all things students read throughout the school year. And then towards the end of the year, I had the conversation about pick a book that you read this year and think about the topics or issues that are addressed in that book. And most students pulled from their literature circle books or their self-selected YA novels. So just kind of some background on the text that students were exposed to. So the research process, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth with this, but a lot of you probably know what I mean when I say teaching students to research for the first time. We had the conversation about what's research versus what's Google searching. How do I decide on topics for research? How do I know what I want to research, right? And that's where we tied the research to the book. Pull things that are introduced or mentioned or that you find interesting in your books that you've read throughout the year. We also talked about how to turn those into questions, how to use the Gale databases that our district had access to. And then we also had extensive conversations about searching for your topics. Students very often just wanted to search their whole question. Like if they had a question about policing policies in Alabama or something like that, they would be typing in, what are the policing policies in Alabama, things like that. And so they would often get frustrated if they couldn't find the results that they wanted. And so we had to have a frequent conversation, recurring conversation about searching by keywords, right? And so that was part of what we did, being able to skim through text to find the answers to your questions. And what do you do if you can't find the answer to your question, right? Some different problem solving and troubleshooting techniques for students who got frustrated when they couldn't find what they were looking for. And so that's a lot of what we talked about, MLA citations, paraphrasing. So the culminating project was a combination of these things. It was a combination of students taking from what they've read in the text throughout the year and what they researched and saying, okay, what issue in a book that you've read this year that you did a little bit of research on are you the most passionate about? And that's what I told them. I said, there's nothing off limits if it's something that you're passionate about. And in the next slide, I'm going to show y'all a lot of the topics that students ended up choosing. And I know that if I were a teacher listening and asking, questions about the presentation, I would say, well, what about, sensitive topics that students may choose to research? And the key word in that is choose, right? So I didn't have any parental or administration issues with any of this because it was all student driven. And therefore your engagement's higher. You don't have to worry about why is my child researching this? It's your child chose to read this book. Your child chose to research this topic. And so it was all stuff that was student driven, which it in all aspects was more beneficial because students were engaged, students were, they saw the real world relevance in it and they were motivated. So invested in the topic. So I asked them when they identified that issue and they had done the research, and some of these questions were introduced before they did the research. Like I told them what this culminating project would be. And then, so they kind of knew what they were looking for when they were doing research. So I asked them, is this an issue in today's society? How could society work towards solving this issue? Do you have ideas for how people can work towards solving the issue in question? And who is someone in a position of power that can help to create change? And that last question, I wanted them to think more specifically about what would that person do, right? What would you want this person that's in a position of power to do to help make steps towards positive change with the particular issue you've identified, inspired by your YA book? So the culminating activity was to write to that person. And sometimes it wasn't a person, sometimes it was an entity. And when I show you all on the next slide, some of the snippets from student letters, you'll see some students chose to write to a particular person. Some students chose to write to a group of people, and some students wrote to like society at large. And I thought that was really cool because I didn't tell them who they had to write to. I just said, write to somebody or some group that you think can make change. And so I said, express your concern, support your viewpoint with your research. So it's the first exposure to having them support with claims that they've researched, right? And then advocate for change. And we also incorporated their ethos, pathos, logos, and rhetorical persuasive appeals in this as well. That was their first kind of hand at messing around with that too. So I'm not going to read all of these to you, and there's obviously no student names on here, but I just took some snapshots from a few different student letters, just so you can see the topics that they picked and who they've addressed their concern letters to. And so I had one student write to the Department of Justice and talk about how the death penalty should be abolished. Another student wrote about abortion. Another student wrote about how video games do not cause violent thoughts or actions. And then another student, my favorite introduction was like, dear internet lurkers, right? So he's writing to like all people on the internet that use social media. And he was talking about how social media can be really detrimental to mental health, is what he talked about. And he's like, I know, I'm an expert. So we talked a lot about using ethos and things like that. So, and then another student wrote about police reform, and another student wrote about the mask mandate. And that was about we did this about the time that Greg Abbott lifted the mask mandate. So I would love to spend a whole lot more time talking to you all about all the different things that happened with these letters. But ultimately, it's to say, I felt like a sense of my students' advocacy and confidence was definitely increased from this. And it's something that I think we can get all adolescents on board with, and helping them build their confidence and their sociopolitical consciousness to know that they can make changes and that their voice does matter. So the reflection questions, y'all have access to my slides, so you can look at those and the slide deck as you open it. I know I'm out of time, so, and my contact information is on this last slide as well. So you can email me if you have any questions, or ask me at the end of the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. That was so interesting. And I have a lot of questions during the Q&A. All right. Now we are going to move to our next speaker, Rosa.
All righty, let me share my screen. And then, sorry, I was tweaking something. Sorry, everything disappeared. Should have done this before. So always happens. I like share my screen and then the little Zoom thing goes away. If I were the Zoom thing, where would I be? You know what? That's okay. We're just gonna do it like this. All righty. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Abby and I are actually cohort mates, and we both graduated from, can y'all hear me? You can hear me, right? Abby's laughing, so I'm assuming that you can hear me. Okay, cool. And so we both recently graduated from the University of Houston with our PhDs. We keep calling each other doctor because we're fancy like that. But today I'll be going over part of my dissertation research, which was a survey of diverse literature used in secondary ELA classrooms. And so, you know, as we all know, there's been a really big push for diversity in children's and young adult publishing. And so I wanted to see the extent to where is it coming actually into the classrooms. And so my research question was, to what extent do secondary ELA teachers integrate diverse lit in their classrooms? When I talk about the term diversity, I am using We Need Diverse's books, a definition of diversity, which talks about recognizing all diverse experiences, including but not limited to LGBTQIA, Native, people of color, gender diversity, people with disabilities, and ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities. And by the way, I'll upload a PDF of my presentation at the end, but to save time, because yeah. And so what I did is I used a survey. I created a survey. The first part was an existing survey, the Teacher Multicultural Attitude Survey. And the second part was an original survey that I created that measured two constructs, which are teacher diverse literature attitudes and teacher diverse literature use. And today for this session, I'll be talking about the third construct, the use, like what kind of texts are teachers using. And so in terms of teacher demographics, I surveyed teachers across 3 school districts in Houston. It was a total of 35 teachers. So grateful for them for participating in a very long survey in the middle of a pandemic. The average years of teaching was 11 years, grade taught. Yeah, it's supposed to be a lot cooler with like the slide animations, but y'all get it. Race, mostly white teachers. Mostly women, and political orientation was pretty varied, with an emphasis or more so on the liberal side. So for my findings, what kind of literature are teachers using? On average, and like recent research shows, that we are seeing a lot more children's and young adult lit coming into classrooms. And so it's 41% opposed to 59% of adult lit. And so it's mostly still adult literature, but children's and young adult lit is increasing. Abbey is obviously not a good example. And I mean, she's a great example, but I mean, like my presentation coming after hers. And so she's one of the ones that are really pushing for children's and YA lit. In terms of genre, it's still predominantly fiction in the teachers that I surveyed across the districts, followed closely by plays, poetry, and nonfiction. Fantasy, short story, and sci-fi and historical fiction were pretty low in the book list that teachers provided. For the publication date, the oldest YA was 1954, whereas the newest was 2018, adult 1957, and newest is 2020. And then here were the averages for the adult was 1964, and the children's YA was 2001 with the average total of 1953. And this is me excluding like Beowulf and some like really older texts. In terms of asking them about the protagonist diversity, own voices, literature, which is a contentious term, so cultural insiders, and then themes in the text. For protagonist diversity, 97% of teachers said that they used text with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but only 35 and 38 said that they used text with characters that were LGBTQIA or people with disabilities. For own voices literature, 100% said that they used text written by and about Black African Americans, and then you can see the trickle down. And then again, Indigenous, Native, First Nations, LGBTQIA, and stories with people with disabilities was only 28%. And then for the bottom and the themes in the text, you can see the different types of themes that I asked about. And then at the very bottom, the ones that explore religious diversity and then address current socio and political issues were the least used. And so the more controversial the topic, the least it was used in classrooms was the finding that I saw. For author race, I had teachers list the top 10 texts that they used most frequently in the last 3 years. And then I took those and I found the author race among other metrics. And then for this, as you can see, 47% of the texts are written by white folks, 30% Black African American authors, 11 Asian Americans, 6 Latinx, 2 Indigenous, Native, First Nations, and then less than 1% were Middle Eastern. And I thought that was interesting because it correlates with the chart at the bottom is the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And their most recent data that was updated in April 16, 2021 shows here like Black African American authors 252, Asian 403, Latinx 228, and then like Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Arab were 37 and 21%. So it looks like what's happening in the publishing industry is similar and parallel to what's happening in classrooms. Also to note, for Asian Americans, for the author race, these were all East Asians or Southeast Asians, not Pacific Islanders. There were no Pacific Islanders in the text that teachers chose. Here are the top 10 authors. They may look really familiar to you all. Out of the top 10 authors, they were all Black, white, or one Asian American, Amy Tan. And here were the top 4 book titles of Mice and Men, Lord of the Flies, Fences, and The Watsons Go to Birmingham. And then these were the average publication dates. So as you can see, pretty still older, with the most recent being 1995. And then I thought, what do these folks look like? So here are the top 10 authors, just so you could see who people are reading the most in the survey that results that I found. Yeah, and so Black, white, and one Asian, no Latinx, no Middle Eastern folks, and then as far as I know, no Indigenous authors. And here were the top 4 most used texts from all 3 school districts. and the people who wrote them. Something else that I found interesting, I asked if you had the option, would you change or modify the types of books you use in class? And then here, 80% of people, of teachers of color said yes, whereas 60% of white teachers said yes. And the difference was statistically significant. For the second one, how do you decide which literature to use in class? The most popular ways that teachers decided were English department, English team lists, and then literature that they personally read. And then followed by district lists, word of mouth, and bestsellers. Ways that teachers would change the existing curriculum, 50% of teachers said that they wanted more diverse books. Also student and teacher choice, more contemporary literature, more relevant and relatable literature, and then also shorter text instead of reading full-on novels. Here are two examples of excerpts of what teachers wrote. One teacher said, I would like to do more contemporary pieces that deal with current race, religious, LGBTQ issues. I also want to diversify selections more. I never have, and I don't know any other teachers who have been able to cover any literature that has diversity of sexual orientation. I would like to diversify more because these students deserve to be able to read something that they can connect to. They deserve to feel seen and understood. And then someone else said, less dead white guys. Students in public schools need more exposure to diverse literature. Factors preventing teacher change. I'd love to hear if this is something that resonates with the teachers that we have in the house. 71% of teachers said district mandates, followed by funding, time and resources, parent complaints, censorship, differentiation concerns, and then issues with books. Which I thought was interesting, because I thought that maybe censorship or parent complaints would be higher, because that's what that's what we see on the media, and that's like the more sensational part that I guess I personally see. But no, it was really district mandates. A teacher said, district guidelines for the text selection have not been updated since the 1990s. The process is cumbersome and often stalls. It's difficult to simultaneously request new titles and plan to perhaps fall back on old titles if permissions don't come through in a timely fashion or at all. One teacher said, we can only read books that fall under district guidelines. Additionally, getting funding to buy even a class set of books is nearly impossible. Yeah, books are expensive. Something else, I don't know how I'm doing. Holly, how am I doing on time? Can you give me a time check, please?
Yes, about 6 more minutes, so you're good.
Okay, perfect. So something else I wanted to throw in here that I found in my dissertation research was I was looking towards also using diverse literature for critical literacy, and I found in talking about James Banks's like approaches to literature, right? We have the contributions, additive, transformative, and then the social action research. For from the responses, very few teachers were using the contributions approach. And so one teacher said Black History Month, Asian Heritage Month, et cetera, to highlight diverse authors. So very few teachers actually wrote that they were using diverse literature in this way, which is really great, right? Most teachers were using it in the additive way. So one teacher said, I'm able to supplement the books that we are required to read in class with outside materials. So as much as I can, I try to bring in articles and videos written by and about diverse writers and speakers. So a lot of teachers in the study talked about how they couldn't actually change the core curriculum, but they could change all the outside text. They can supplement with poetry and with videos and with short stories that were diverse. That was encouraging. And then very few teachers talked about the transformative aspect. One teacher said, we used the novel Ghost Boys by Jewel Parker Rhodes at the beginning of the year to discuss the events of 2019-2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so there were some teachers that were talking about sociopolitical issues and bringing that into their classroom, but there were no excerpts of teachers using it towards social action. So like Abbey talks about like, okay, what are we going to do with these letters? Now we're going to actually make action, and we're going to like do something about the learning that we found. And there weren't any examples of that in the study. Also, two other quotes that I thought were really interesting. This teacher said, I regularly use Amy Tan's short story, Fish Cheeks, to model annotating. Typically, I try to use diverse literature in an unobtrusive way, using it to support whatever text I'm teaching and not building the lesson around the diversity it reflects. this was very interesting and personally incredibly offensive to me. I also, so if y'all have read Fish Cheeks before, Amy Tan, right? It's like the entire story is about internalized racism, and yet this teacher decided to use Amy Tan, but not actually talk about what the story is about, which I thought was very difficult and surprising and problematic. Whereas on the flip side, one teacher said, in deciding which text to use in grade 6-12, we developed a body of literature by diverse authors that centers the BIPOC experience through its characterization or through its themes, oppression, imperialism, and colorism. And so we have some teachers that are like, oh, we're gonna do all of it. We're only gonna talk about diverse authors, which is cool, but then also about the experience through oppression, imperialism, colorism, which are very important topics. Of course, we need this to build sociopolitical consciousness. But then something that I was thinking about is like, can we do a balance? Can we also read about diverse texts about students that are not suffering, that are just like having crushes and doing other teenagery things that normal, teenagers go through? Or can we have a balance? And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Constance was awesome, yes. So implications for practice teachers, there are lots of contemporary diverse books, classroom libraries, supplemental readings. I'll post a few, drop a few links in a bit. There's also lots of free workshops, interrogating positionalities, thinking about teachers, activists, especially something that I was thinking about is like the white teachers who said that they did not need to change the books, right? Districts, really reconsidering district lists, increasing diversity genres, more contemporary titles, providing more funding for teachers, providing more flexibility for teachers, trusting your teachers more, right? Is something that we saw. And then for teacher educators, making sure to work with districts to diversify the curricula, providing workshops on using diverse literature for critical literacy. This is not just something, this is hard, this is difficult, it takes time and it takes work. And I think that teachers would appreciate more support from teacher educators. And then also more opportunities for maybe DEI training, official training and such. And that's it. Holly, back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. That was interesting. I guess I will open the floor for questions. If you want, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it. Either one is fine.
I have a question. I'm curious, I'm curious if the district mandates thing, Rosa, is, was this a district that was particularly stringent? Like, was this city a stringent city in your, like, just in, you may not know that necessarily, but I'm curious how that transfers to the rest of the country. And I'm not saying that you even know this necessarily, but I find it really intriguing.
Yeah, so I think we could tag team with Abbey. I mean, we've been in Houston for a minute and we know a lot of other school districts here. In terms of school districts, so ours was both based in Houston, and as far as I know, so like my own teaching experience, I taught in A-Leaf. I could teach whatever, like we had anchor text, but then other than that, we could teach whatever text we want, and we were really pretty flexible. And then we could look at the, that doesn't answer your question. So my answer is, I think that, actually, Abby, you go. Look, I've been out of the classroom for a few years.
So I kind of what you were saying about A-Leaf, the district in which I teach is moving towards less control over what students are reading and more like student choice and teacher autonomy. And I think that the trend is starting to go that way. When I taught middle school and middle grades back in like 2010, it was really big in middle grades then, and it's been really successful. And so they're working their way towards high school, implementing that in high schools as well. I can't speak for all districts and all, areas. I think a lot of the district administration and leaders in the area realize that Houston is the most diverse or one of the most diverse cities in the nation. And I think that they have realized that they have to stop fighting the inevitable change and quit pressuring teachers to use texts that are not relevant to students. And so I think it's working its way towards that. And I know some teachers in the chat that are in this area, I think, right, have said kind of the same thing about district mandates too. So I would be curious to hear if any teachers that are not in the Houston area, what their experiences with their districts are too. So I have, as a teacher in my district though, have definitely seen the pressures lessened, and which is how we're able to get, you know, I don't want to say get away with, you know, but like how we're able to teach what we feel should be taught for our students, students best.
That's really interesting. Amy could maybe speak to that too, because there's also sometimes a misconception by teachers of what they can and can't do. And it varies on a department chair's interpretation or a principal's interpretation, while the district, and I know Amy is probably monitoring maybe a couple of these, but at the district level, they're not attempting to overly monitor it here. It's more accurately self-monitored. What the real goal is, can you teach in a way that you're still moving your kids towards the mastery of standards, right? And so Jeff's conversation yesterday was really important about, you know the books, know your rationale for doing it, and you'll probably be okay. And I think that's generally the case here in CCSD, unless you're blocked locally, and I mean literally locally, by your department chair kind of discouraging you or the principal, but you're not going to get that officially from the English Language Arts office at the district.
Yeah, oftentimes it'll say like suggested text, right? And you have to look at the word suggested and say, okay, not required, right? So it is, like you had said, kind of up to interpretation of who it is that's implementing the curriculum too. That's a good point.
Yeah, so one of my districts that I saw, they are forced to use a specific set list. One of the districts that I think have maybe like 1 or 2 anchor texts that they use, but all the other ones, if the team decides, then they can use it. And then one, is a lot more flexible, like Abbey said.
Thank you.
We do have a few questions in the chat. I think the Houston size was answered. I think it's number 4. And then Stephanie wants to know what do you think was most surprising from your findings, Dr. Nam? Is it Nam? Sorry.
Yeah, it's Nam.
Nam, okay.
Yeah, thanks. The most surprising that I didn't actually report, but I feel like if I have this platform that I should, is that so like I said, I measured 3 constructs, right? Teacher multicultural attitudes, teacher diverse attitudes towards diverse literature, and then teacher diverse literature use. And the one thing that was outstanding and like statistically significant at like 0.000 was that teachers' political orientation affected their teacher multicultural attitudes, and they also affected their teacher diverse literature attitudes. So out of all factors, grade level, race, district, like all of the factors, the only thing, and it affected it tremendously and predicted it, was teacher political orientation, on whether or not they thought that diverse literature was valuable, that they wanted to use it, and whether they thought that multiculturalism in the classroom was important. So I'll just leave that at that.
And that's even discounting what race or how they might present themselves in race or economic status as well.
Yep. Which I think that people may immediately think is like confusing, but I guess like the thing is, like in Houston, and especially in Houston, we're an incredibly diverse city. And so just because that you identify as Asian American does not mean that you're going to be more liberal, or just because you identify as Latinx does not mean that you're going to be more liberal or conservative or etc. And so I thought, I'm not sure if this would hold true in other cities, but in the Houston area, it did, like significantly.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You should try to puzzle out how to write about that in some ways. And in the class that I taught last year, it's a graduate class last semester, I think there's maybe more universally joining by class in terms of where you sit economically and how you react to things, especially in a big multicultural city. And Las Vegas and Houston are probably similar in the ways that they're cosmopolitan in terms of what is the real makeup, right? And less identifying by those racial markers. Maybe people start grouping by economic markers and the opportunity markers that they have. And of course, I think it's all of it plays on top of each other, but it's hard to decipher, right?
There's another question in the chat. Juliana wants to know, what are some book recommendations that you have that diverse characters are not going something monumental necessary, but more like typical teenage situation?
Yeah, so I dropped a link for We Need Diverse Books, and so there's just like a list, and then also I was thinking we could just crowdsource. We have like 40 people in this call. We're all teachers. We all read, and so if we could just like drop things, I'll drop a few that I like and think about. Great. I'm mostly gonna do graphic novels. I'm just like a huge fan of graphic novels, and so. Yeah,
And I look for awards like young adult literature awards and children's lit awards as well when I go to try to find literature, and that's a really a great way to figure out. There's an article I read about it, and it gave me a link to or a list of all the awards. So finding young adult literature awards and children's lit awards are a great way to find diverse literature for your classes.
I thought listening to the panel that Ricky chaired yesterday between Eric and Cynthia, I think there were a lot of good suggestions in that chat at the time, but listening and you know, confronting publishers at conferences. Well, when's your next Indigenous book? Or when's your next book that's about this population? Or what do you have that represents things? And make them tell you, right? I thought that was really, that ended up, I don't know if they voiced it, but it ended up at least in the chat. So, and I know Ricky has tons of great ideas in this. She's being really quiet, but she's a real advocate for how to get more diversity in the curriculum and in classrooms too. So
I'm being quiet because I'm typing, Steve.
oh, I'm inviting you, Ricky, to go ahead and share if you'd like.
Well, Morgan Jackson's on this call, and she recommended Charming as a Verb to me, which I loved that book, and I'm going to be using that with my students. I love Ancestor Approved. If I ever get out of here. I mean, there are just so many. It's I think it's beyond like the monumental. It's like what themes are you seeking? Would be one way that I would think about it. But and then what counts as monumental? I mean, for some kids, going to college is monumental, and but yeah, trying to resist like the trauma stories and the deficit, like the damage-centered stories, is definitely a helpful thing that I always think about when I'm building a list.
That's really good. Sharon Flake, actually, in her interview that I did with her, talks about that, about especially within African-American literatures, the way in which maybe we need to avoid the trauma. And she talked about some of her books and others in the African-American writing community who are trying to write books just about joy in everyday life, and they don't have to be trauma, right? And she talked about it in really articulate ways, which I could just fail in summary. So if you get a chance to see her interview when I get it posted, I'll do it. Oh, and hers are posted. Good. I got Joe's and Sharon's posted. So you can find those and listen to them in 2 parts. Yeah.
Okay. If no one has any other questions, it is 1:20, and I know you're all probably going to go to another session, so I wanted to give you time, a little bit of a break. But if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, we will see. Thank you for attending. Really appreciate
Don't close it, Holly, till everybody gets a chance to click on that link that Morgan shared. She's right. It's a really good source. So. And put your CCSD identifier in here, right? So.
Thanks, Drs. Bachmann and Nam. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Dr. Ginsberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome. I hope you're both going to publish what you presented.
That's next up, you know. We need to set a calendar, hold each other accountable.
Yep.
Buy ice cream. You know.
That's what we're good at, holding each other accountable.
When is our next meeting? Tuesday next week.
Yes.
All right.
Abby, all your pictures, I was like, I know where that is. That's the Berry Center. That's
I know. I was like, that was graduation.
Well, I used to teach in the same school district that Abby is teaching in.
Cool.
I'm just making sure that all the CCSD folks have a chance to put their name in the chat for attendance before I close this out. But
Okay.
everyone else, once you've done that, you can log out and get ready for the for the lunchtime panel.
Alrighty, great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, thank y'all. Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, good.
Okay, Amy, I think I'm gonna duck out too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.